there are so many wider societal problems for all sorts of different reasons that basically force people to stay on benefits, at least for some time.
But you can say at the same time, of course we've got to root out waste and inefficiency. Of course we've got to pay tax dollar bills wisely. Why is it we've got 1.2 million extra under 25s taking sickness benefit compared to 5 years ago? It's a legitimate question.
You can tell that it's politically difficult for Starmer because for the first time that I can recall in this government, they've backtracked on something.
It's the other thing. I mean, mental well-being, illness, it's a spectrum, right? And
but you do think
there's
too many.
I think there's an overdiagnosis, but also there are too many people being written off. And to your point about treatment, there's too many people who just aren't getting the support they need. So if you can get that support...
That is Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, talking to Laura Kunsberg yesterday about overdiagnosis of mental health problems. The statistics bear it out. There's been an increase of 1.8 million people claiming sickness benefits since 2019. And the biggest rises have been amongst the young. The Labour government want to see if there's anything that can be done.
This is partly being born of financial necessity. Ministers are arguing that it's also the right, the moral thing to do. And yet, it may become the biggest parliamentary rebellion we've seen yet in the Starmer government. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And the debate that's raging within the Labour Party, within the Labour government, apparently within the cabinet, over what to do about the ballooning welfare budget is really alive and kicking. And on the one side, you have people saying it's just not Labour to be cutting the benefits of disabled people and the poor and condemning more people to poverty. But on the other side, you have the numbers. And the numbers show that there has been a surge in those people who are claiming sickness benefit over the past few years, which has led to a ballooning in the welfare bill. And, now 1.2 million people under the age of 25 are claiming sickness benefits. And so some Labour ministers are saying, well, of course we've got to look at this.
Yeah, the numbers really are very, very striking. And the numbers, there's always been a lot of people who, for one reason or another, are in receipt of either incapacity benefit or personal independence payment. And this is, as ever with benefit stuff, it gets complicated and Byzantine quite quickly. There is a lot of focus in particular at the moment on personal independence payments. And those are payments which are not means tested, and they are given to people who have a disability or an illness because they are faced with extra costs that the rest of us are not faced with in order to go about their everyday lives. But it is absolutely true that especially since the pandemic, there have been very marked and very considerable increases on all manner of sickness and incapacity related benefits, especially with regards to young people. So to take another statistic, in England and Wales, the number of working age adults receiving disability or incapacity benefits was 2.8 million in 2019. That's approximately 1 in 13. It's now 4 million by 2024, so that's approximately 1 in 10. And in particular, mental health conditions have been a significant factor in that rise. So now approximately 55% of the post-pandemic increase in disability benefit claims is attributed to mental health issues. And that is particularly striking among the young. There are now 1.2 million people under 25 claiming sickness benefits. 1 in 15 of that age group are claiming. That is up from 1 in 24 pre-pandemic. And again, that rise, in particular for young people, is being driven by mental health problems. And one other fact for you, this is something we've seen across other industrialised countries post-COVID, but Britain is an outlier in the sense that most of the other industrialised countries have seen a return to pre-pandemic levels of people on incapacity and sickness benefits. Britain, for whatever reason, has not.
That is the key point, isn't it? If you were describing a phenomenon that was common across the Western world, for example, that the numbers of young people with mental health problems rose during the pandemic, it's the same everywhere. It's not. It's that people have gone on to those benefits, and the numbers have not come down in the way that they have throughout the rest of Europe. So for West Streeting to say that there has been an overdiagnosis sounds like a statement of fact, but in a politically charged environment, it is seen as a contentious and tendentious thing to have said. And that is why you're getting this pushback now on, predictably, yes, from the left of the Labour Party, but other kind of mainstream Labour figures as well are saying you just can't do this. And kind of, the mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, one of those who's come out and said, this is not, we shouldn't be doing this. We're condemning more people to a life in poverty if we go ahead with this.
I mean, I suppose it depends why you think there has been this increase and this stickiness with regards to people on these benefits, right? So obviously there is one argument, which is to say that these benefits are too generous and therefore they allow people to use a very old-fashioned word that used to be used with regards to benefits, which is to malinger, that people end up sort of lingering on these benefits for too long. There are others, of course, there's a different analysis which says that, look, there are so many wider societal problems for all sorts of different reasons that basically force people to stay on benefits, at least for some time. And therefore, unless you address those structural problems with society with regards to poverty, with regards to lack of opportunity, lack of stable jobs, all of those sorts of things, mental health stuff, NHS, people ending up on health-related incapacity benefits because they just can't get elective operations to deal with their hip problems or to deal with their physical problems, and mental health services being as poor as they are, then the argument would be that you are basically taking away the support, but you're not taking away the root cause of the things which are driving these matters. And it is complicated, as ever with discussion around benefits. I mean, one thing is definitely true, one thing that Liz Kendall, the Work and Pension Secretary, is arguing, is that you can certainly say that at the moment, what we have in Britain is a set of quite perverse incentives that are built into the system. Because the UK is actually one of the least generous countries in the world for people receiving basic unemployment benefits. Anyone who is what used to be called JSA, Job Seekers Allowance, they know that these things are not generous whatsoever. By contrast, if you're assessed as being too sick to work, then you receive a much higher rate of support through incapacity benefits, which have no strings attached. So what you can certainly say is there are incentives in the current system to say, if you're looking for work, that there is an incentive for you to claim disability or sickness-related benefit because you will get paid considerably more. And as I say, there's no conditionality to it.
Yeah, and that is why there is such sort of bitter division within the Labour Party at the moment. Because, the argument from Blair onwards has been that you've got to do welfare reform for the sake of the welfare state, because the welfare state would collapse in on itself if you never reformed the way benefits were being delivered. I also think there is a danger that the left of the Labour Party end up in a way that the Democratic Party in the US is, where you sort of find yourself on the wrong side of history. You can oppose what Elon Musk is doing in government with his chainsaw, but you can say at the same time, of course, we've got to root out waste and inefficiency. Of course, we've got to pay tax dollar bills wisely. But you get the sense that slightly that the Labour Party, some in the Labour Party, are saying, well, we just can't do welfare reform. It's too, it's going to punish the poorest, and that's not what Labour is about. And you just think, well, hang on, you are leaving the ground open then for others to fill the void and say, of course we can do this. Why is it we've got 1.2 million extra under 25s taking sickness benefit compared to 5 years ago? It's a legitimate question.
I mean, the truth is that this is really politically difficult for Starmer. You can tell it's politically difficult for Starmer because for the first time that I can recall in this government, they backtracked on something. There was a suggestion that the government would freeze PIP, personal independence payments, that the rate would not go up this year. Now, not something that the government had confirmed it was going to do, but it had been briefed that they were going to do that. And this weekend, we saw the government briefing that they would not do that. Now, there's always a question that you wonder, are they just flying a kite and sort of suggesting they might do something, so when they walk back from it, everyone can say, well, we've got a victory and the rest of the package will swallow. I'm not sure about that. I think that it is clear that Rachel Reeves is looking for serious savings from the welfare bill, which is, massive. Welfare, which includes pensions, is nudging £300 billion a year. It's really substantial. If you can't touch pensions, they're not going to touch pensions. That means you have to go for the rest of the benefit bill. I think it's clear that they were thinking about freezing PIP payments. But then when you had someone like George Osborne coming out, as he did, and saying that even he wouldn't have done that, this created a kind of cascade and backlash among Labour backbenchers who have been really, really concerned about it. They've had MPs, scores of MPs, every single backbencher Labour MP have been going into Downing Street to be briefed about these measures. And I think it's fair to say many of them simply have not been convinced. I spoke to Nadia Whittome, who's a backbench Labour MP, on my LBC show yesterday, and she does speak for many of her colleagues.
Obviously, the plans as out, or the briefing this morning, talking about the freeze to PIP, retreating on that. That is just one element to the overall package. There would still be substantial changes, still potentially substantial savings to be derived from it. If that is the main change, would that be enough for you and your colleagues?
No, it's not enough. We can't see any cuts in welfare.
None at all?
No, because what we've inherited and the problem that our government now has to fix is we're seeing the impacts of the long-term impacts of austerity, of increasing and entrenched inequality, of public services crumbling. We've made a good start to fixing that in some areas, like record NHS funding, increases in workers' rights. Now we have to go further, and that cannot include a continuation of what George Osborne and David Cameron did. I mean, George Osborne said...
And at the end of that clip there, you hear her saying, look, if George Osborne wouldn't even do it, why would we? I just think it's a slightly incredible position, given the state of the government's finances, to say there can be no cuts at all. Not to even look at it, not to even work out whether there is a different way of doing it and saving money. It seems to me, but obviously, not only the backbenchers, I suspect within cabinet as well, there must have been serious pushback at Starmer's and Reeve's plans, because I would think that if you felt that you had the cabinet united behind these measures, then you would go out and sell it to the backbenchers and say you've got to fall into line. And this is a classic sign when you're in government that you haven't got the cabinet behind you, because that emboldens the backbenchers to go and say, no, you know what, I'm not for this.
Yeah, and there have been reports, plenty of reports about cabinet splits, including from people like Ed Miliband, Lucy Powell and others, Angela Rayner, broadly on the kind of more left-wing part of the cabinet, expressing concerns at cabinet about Liz Kendall's plans, and indeed Keir Starmer allowing the cabinet to run on, to allow, such was the strength of feeling, to allow these expressions of discontent to be heard, and that's probably why some of these suggestions or some of these ideas have been rolled back to some extent. I mean, it's worth thinking about kind of why these things are so controversial. I mean, for the Labour Party, psychologically, in its bones, welfare cuts are deeply, deeply uncomfortable, right? It's the equivalent for the Conservative Party of tax increases. There is just something in them congenitally. Even if they can see the intellectual case, even if they can see that the budget might be getting out of control, even if they can see, which I think is a powerful argument, to say, well, there's nothing intrinsically Labour about allowing people, particularly young people who should be in the kind of, start of their careers, to allow that difficulty of remaining workless, which could have a long-term scarring effects on their income potential and their earnings potential throughout their lives. There's nothing intellectually Labour about that. But poverty in Britain is a massive problem. It's a problem which has got worse and worse and worse. And the easiest way of doing something about that, just on a simple kind of ledger, on a balance sheet in front of you, if you want to pull a lever in the Treasury, if you're a Labour minister or an MP and you want to pull a lever just to address poverty, the easiest thing to do is to increase benefits in one form or another, because by definition, usually the people in receipt of those benefits are the poorest people. So if you want to lessen inequality, if you want to do good old-fashioned Labour stuff, which is redistribution and reducing both relative and absolute poverty, the best thing you can do is increase benefits. If you decrease them, then by definition, you're doing the opposite and threatening to make poverty worse. So if you take that together, and the thing I get a sense of, from Labour MPs, even from people who are not sort of the usual suspects on the left of the party, I think what there is a concern about is that, each of these things individually, let's take the changes that they announced to the winter fuel allowance pensions. Okay, intellectual case for that. International aid cuts. Okay, intellectual case for that. The rumoured 11% spending cuts for non-protected departmental budgets that might be coming up in the spring statement and beyond, the spending round, okay, intellectual case for that. Benefits changes, okay, intellectual case for that. But if you take them all together, what have you got? You have got something that looks a little bit like George Osborne's prospectus, or you've got something that looks like austerity. And I think for Labour MPs, yeah, they feel pleased with some of the things. You heard Nadia Whittam talking about it there, extra NHS spending, changes in workers' rights. But they need something, I think they need something that they can say, what are we taking back to our people to say that we've done for them? Because at the moment, it feels like a programme of pain.
Yes, and you've got on the left of the party people saying, well, why don't we just impose a wealth tax of 2% for people with estates over, with assets of more than £10 million? That will raise billions and billions of pounds. And that, going back to sort of the redistribution idea, of course, you do tax the wealthiest and, you help the poorest. Of course, the tax system is already progressive in the sense that it does tax the richest the most and the poorest the least.
Although often as a proportion of their income and wealth, it can be much less.
Yes, exactly. And the worry for Rachel Reeves again is, if you pull one lever in the Treasury, then where does the money come from? If you do upgrade benefits, say you're going to increase benefits, well, where's the money going to come from to pay for that? And there are no easy options, as we've seen with the protests that there have been over, the rise in employers' national insurance contributions, and the fact that you're seeing a lot of reports now saying that the rate of employing new people has slowed right down, normally a leading indicator of maybe the economy is going into recession. And so, you do certain things and they have certain consequences. And, you could tax people with, big estates or, introduce a wealth tax. But that is something the Labour government has been loath to do and has said it wouldn't do.
This is the other challenge, right, is that obviously what we've seen over the last decade or so is an enormous increase in the number of people on benefits who are in work. Right, it's just their incomes are low.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about benefits, it's easy to think or to assume that we're just talking about the workless. That is often not the case. Many people, I think 40-50% of people on universal credit are in some form of work. What we've seen over the last decade and a half or so is an enormous rise in the working poor. And again, the easiest way to deal with that, if you're a Labour minister, is to increase benefits. There is obviously a problem over the long term, though, which is if that's your kind of remedy as a kind of social democrat, always to just basically increase money from the state, there is an argument that over time what you're doing is basically creating an economy where there are more and more people dependent on the state in work, which is letting employers off the hook in not increasing wages enough, in not creating jobs which are sufficient. They're basically outsourcing some of their responsibility to create a good standard of life for their employees to the state. So there's always this kind of conundrum, there's always this sort of delicate balance. But what this all adverts to, of course, is the fact that what we're going to see over the next year or so is we're seeing that the economic prospects for Britain darken, not get better. That is not entirely Rachel Reeves' fault. We're obviously seeing part of it. The OECD today released some new growth figures forecast, which showed that Britain would be the second fastest growing economy in the G7. But that ain't saying much because of the G7 overall, largely saying that is because of the uncertainty created in Washington, D.C. by the new Trump administration. But it doesn't really matter why. The net effect is the same. And as a result, the limited fiscal headroom that we saw Reeves have in the autumn budget already disappeared. And so in order for her to keep to her fiscal rules, if that's what she intends to do, and it seems that she is because she's so worried about rising potential for borrowing costs to rise even further for the UK, then it means that the only other option that she has, unless she wants to tax more, is to go back again and again to departmental budgets. And the DWP, being such a big part of that, as I say, £300 billion, is the most obvious place to go to. The crux, the difficulty for her in terms of Labour politics, is it's also probably the department of all departments where, rightly or wrongly, your average, your sort of centre Labour MP, your kind of just bog standard Labour MP on the backbenchers, feels, for all sorts of reasons, most uncomfortable about touching.
And that is why Starmer is in an awkward position. So too Rachel Reeves. And we're going to hear what Rachel Reeves has decided on all of this in about 10 days' time when she makes her spring statement.
And as a kind of salutary thing for Keir Starmer, there is a long history of Labour governments in particular trying to grapple with benefits cuts or changes to the welfare state more generally, and them being very politically difficult. but internally. I mean, you can go back a long way and even go back to the problems that the Attlee government had when they were making changes on free prescriptions for glasses and for dentistry. And what happened? Nye Bevan, the creator of the NHS, walked out of the cabinet in a huff about it, took Harold Wilson with him, great bit of political sort of chicanery from him. And it goes on and on. And right, you go back to the early Blair period as well. John, you probably remember this when, Harriet Harman,
Frank Field were falling out.
They were told they had to make changes in particular to benefits for single mothers and all of these sorts of things. Huge problems. They both lose their job. On and on it goes. Happened with Blair, happened with Brown. It just touches a part of the Labour psyche that is really difficult and unique, and you do not have that problem with Conservative governments.
No, but there is a difference, isn't there? I was struck last week when we were up in Hull with Keir Starmer, and he's announcing kind of abolishing NHS England. And you think, well, but only a Labour government would dare to do that sort of reform, because the Tories would think there is too much political jeopardy for them to do that, because everyone thinks, oh, well, the Tories, they're all about privatising the National Health Service, and they're all about, cutting. And, you remember Peter Lilly going on that song about how, the benefit scroungers, and that they were all kind of single mums, and it was all, everyone was kind of having a laugh at the expense of the welfare system. Well, Labour has never been that. But Labour has been the party that has been able to reform because it's sort of been trusted to. But by God, it is painful to do so. And every time they embark on something like this, of course, it frightens a certain core of the Labour movement. And remember, so many of the MPs have come from a background where they've worked for lobby groups, pressure groups that are involved
charities,
in charities,
poverty charities. Yeah,
exactly,
that's their background.
Exactly, that is their background. And so this is the people that have kind of propelled them into politics.
And it's a powerful group, and
it's a very powerful lobby. They're incredible. If you want to talk about deep state, I mean, which is a phrase I hate, but there is a very powerful group of voices that you will hear on the radio endlessly saying you can't do this because of that. You can't do this because it will hurt the very poorest,
and
most
they might
vulnerable.
not be wrong.
And they may not be wrong. No, absolutely right.
But
But it means that anyone who wants to even introduce modest reforms struggles to get them done. Blair tried it, talked about the scars on his back, but said unless we reform the welfare state collapses because the cost of it will make it implode. And you can see that Starmer's trying to do something similar, but with all the same problems that previous Labour leaders have had down the ages. I bet you thought we were going to get through a whole episode of The Newsagents without uttering those two words, Donald and Trump. Wrong. Sorry about that. We've now got to the point
You're
in
listening
the
to
show.
the wrong show, honestly.
Yeah, we've now got to the point in the show where we do the madness section. Except it's not mad, and it's actually quite interesting what Donald Trump is trying to do. Let me just read you a part of a post that was on Truth Social, Donald Trump's social media platform, where he's talking about the pardons that Joe Biden issued before he left office, and that is a common thing that presidents do before they leave office. Donald Trump did it himself in 2021 before he left office. Joe Biden did it at the beginning of this year. Anyway, this is what Trump says. The pardons that Sleepy Joe Biden gave to the Unselect Committee of Political Thugs and many others are hereby declared void, vacant, and of no further force or effect, in block capitals, needless to say, because of the fact that they were done by auto pen. So because they were auto signed, Donald Trump is trying to declare them null and void. Well, you could say this is just Donald Trump going off on one because he wants to make a political point against Sleepy Joe Biden. But maybe he can. Maybe he will. And what if he instructs his Justice Department to arrest some of those people who Joe Biden pardoned?
Look, the presidential pardon power, for good or ill, is basically a power of kings. And I think it's highly unlikely, even with a Conservative Supreme Court, that if it went all the way to the Supreme Court, I think it's very unlikely that because it was signed by an auto pen, that even that Supreme Court would say that those Bidens were void or null. But it is part of a kind of wider piece that we've been talking about a lot. And in a way, it's very easy to get distracted, as ever with Trump, by the kind of fire and fury and the daily escapades and the kind of fireworks that we see every single day, and to lose sight of the wider themes. But the But one of the most important themes of Trump 2, particularly at variance really with Trump 1 that we've seen play out over the last 10 weeks or so, has been this pushing and pushing and pushing of the limits of presidential authority, of seeing exactly what he can get away with under the Constitution and indeed potentially beyond the powers conferred to him by the Constitution. And we're seeing that in area after area. Trump 2 is as much as anything a theory in the maximalist powers of the presidency, which to be honest is being aided and abetted by a Congress which is completely pliant. And we're seeing this in area after area. We saw it with the pardons last night, but we also saw, again, in the last 24 hours, the White House gearing up for the most significant legal showdowns of the his second term thus far via something he's tried to do this weekend, which is the deportation of foreign nationals, various Venezuelan migrants who have been accused of crimes. They were told by a judge, or the Trump administration was told by a judge, that they could not be deported. And the Trump administration went ahead and did it anyway. And of course, for some people, they have been waiting for this moment when they have said and have felt that Trump was going to ignore a court order, and that would provoke a constitutional crisis, or certainly a constitutional moment. And some people are saying that that moment has come already.
Yeah, so 2 plane loads of Venezuelan migrants have been deported to El Salvador, to some supermax hideous prison where they kind of treat you like crap.
It's not a holiday, I think.
It's not a holiday. The White House is saying, no, we didn't disobey a court order. It's just that when the court order came through, the planes were already in the air over international waters and couldn't be turned back. And they're citing some law from 1789.
1798, I think, actually.
1798. I got the numbers the wrong way around there.
From the Adams administration.
So
they were controversial even in 1798, let alone now.
Exactly. Yeah. And there is another case as well, which, maybe in and of itself, wouldn't normally attract that much attention. But there is a Lebanese doctor, kidney specialist called Rasha Alawaya, 34-year-old from Rhode Island, has apparently got a valid US visa, but has been deported back to Lebanon because of, the protests over Gaza and the like. But this person, the court ordered, should not be deported. And they have been deported anyway. So it is the government, the administration, the executive, saying, no, we're going to do what we like, even though the judiciary has said no. And there comes a point where the challenge is, whether it be over Joe Biden's pardons, whether it be over a Lebanese doctor getting sent back to his country, whether it be over a bunch of Venezuelan hoodlums who are put on a plane to El Salvador, who has the power? Do the courts, the judiciary, have the power as part of the 3 co-equal branches of government to decide this? Or can the president just totally disregard what the courts say? And at this point, we are seeing something play out which undermines and threatens the whole basis of the US Constitution, the idea that there are 3 co-equal branches. Trump's view is, no, I'm the boss.
We've seen this play out again and again in the first 10 weeks, right? In particular with regards to the question of funding. I mean, the way it's supposed to work is that Congress, as the first branch of government, Article 1 of the Constitution, appropriates the money and dictates how it is to be spent. On a literal reading of the Constitution, the President simply does what Congress, with regards to that, tells him to do. Trump has decided to take a very different view. He, of course, with Musk and Doge, has decided that even if Congress has mandated that money be spent and has, signed the laws and has passed the laws in order to do that, the President comes along and Musk comes along and says, actually, no, that's not going to be spent anymore, or we're going to shut down that program, despite the fact that Congress has mandated it to be there. Even speculation about shutting down whole agencies of the government, including the Department for Education, which again, only Congress technically can shut down. But of course, so much of this, right, goes down to Trump will do what he can get away with doing, right? It is up to Congress to assert its authority and to assert that the president must do what they have told him to do by law. And in a way, if they are unwilling or unable to do that, and it is certainly the case that the Republican majorities in both houses right now are unwilling to do that, then they are allowing the vacuum to be there to allow Trump to behave in an extra legal, illegal fashion. It is on them.
Well, look, there's the other classic example is what has happened with TikTok in America, whereby legislation is passed to ban TikTok through the houses of Congress. So the legislature ban it. It then goes to the executive, to the president's desk, for him to sign it. He signs it. There is then an appeal against it by TikTok that goes to the highest court in the land, to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court upholds the ban on TikTok. Last time I looked, TikTok was still functioning in the US because Donald Trump has decreed it to be so. Louis XIV, the Sun King, l'état c'est moi, I am the state. And now we've got the Sunbed King, Donald Trump, saying exactly the same.
You used that in a VT on the 10 o'clock
I
at
haven't.
some point.
First outing.
Whatever.
First outing for the Sunbed King. Thought of it there and then.
I mean, this is why, on a purely kind of theoretical level, a Trump presidency is fascinating for political scientists and just people interested in politics, right? Which is that, we sometimes talk about constitutions and political settlements as if they're set in stone. They're not.
They're not.
Political institutions are just ideas that are in our heads, and they rely on the commitment of political elites to ensure that they're adhered to, right? There is nothing, they're not like the laws of physics. There's nothing to guarantee that like the sun will always rise every morning, that the Constitution will always be adhered to, right? Even one which is as apparently immutable and as prescriptive as the American Constitution is, right? And there was a good piece in the New York Times the other day we talk a lot about constitutional crisis, which I think in a way kind of probably helps Trump, because if you're always talking about constitutional crisis, then as ever you can sound hysterical and you run out of vocabulary, right? And I'm not sure we're at a constitutional crisis moment yet, because a constitutional crisis is when the political order just shuts down. The current constitution fails to work. I think the term that this writer was using, which I think is a helpful one, is to talk about what America is in at the moment, and it's being accelerated by Trump too. It's constitutional rot. It's where just the kind of foundations of the Constitution itself gradually start to disintegrate. And it is not overnight. It is a slow process, but it is probably quickening. And it is quickening not because of something external that has happened. It is nothing, again, like the laws of physics, which have just come along and changed everything. It is because the players of the custodians of that constitutional settlement, which ultimately are always just politicians, are choosing or electing, for whatever particular reason, not to perform their duty as previous generations have done. I.e., when the Constitution was written, I think it would have not occurred to the founding fathers in the 18th century that Congress, and it is a paradox, right? You've got people in Congress in America, they've risen to the top of the political tree. It is not easy to become a congressman. It is even harder to become a senator. You have to work your way through your party machine. You have to raise endless amounts of money. You must think you have something in particular to offer. And yet, for so many at the top of Congress at the moment, to be honest, in the Republican and the Democratic parties, they are electing, in many ways, to have a quiet life. Despite all of that effort, despite all of that political power that is potentially in their hands, they are choosing not to exercise it because they're afraid of Donald Trump.
Yeah, absolutely terrified of him and don't want to do anything that rocks the boat. And there's a part of me, and we had a discussion this morning before, we have our morning editorial call where we talk about, we bat around what ideas we want to discuss on the show today. And, I kind of thought, oh God, Donald Trump saying he's going to revoke Biden's pardons. This is just bullshit. This is just another headline seeking move. But it is part of a piece. You can't ignore it either. This is the president speaking, saying, I am going to do this stuff. And on a whole, as we've tried to lay out in this section, there have been a whole series of efforts to undermine, gradually, the rule of law and the supremacy of courts to make decisions. And the White House saying, yeah, I know the courts have ruled this, but we're going to do that anyway.
Well, what did he say? Tweet the other day, or part on Truth Social the other day. He who saves his country does not violate any law. And I think that, that tells you something about the way that the Trump courts see politics right now. And again, I don't want to over-dramatize it. What's the best sort of reading that you could put on it? Well, you could say that, look, the political system in America has atrophied for a long time. The sort of regulatory state has become too burdensome. We're seeing that debate play out in our own country a little bit about the idea that there needs to be more direct democratic control over the organs of the state. And the presidency, particularly in a world where Congress and the courts have stopped working perhaps as efficaciously as they might have done, the presidency is in a good position as the executive branch to try and push some of those changes through. And, I think there's some truth in that. But at the same time, what you can clearly see from the Trump administration, and it's always been there, is not just frustration, but over the last 10 weeks or so, a deep disdain for law itself. And when you start going on down that road, it's only a dark place that it can lead you.
We'll be back after the break with what is happening in Serbia, in Hungary, and why it matters to the whole idea of Russia and its power in the world.
That was the sound of the streets of Belgrade in Serbia this weekend. More than 100,000 people taking to the streets, not just in Belgrade, but also across cities in Serbia for demonstrations against the government, against President Aleksandar Vucic's government. And we thought we'd just talk about them briefly because this is a story we think that you should keep an eye on. It's been rumbling along for some months now, protest against his government. Serbia, in case you don't follow the politics, is probably at the moment, along with Hungary certainly, some of the most pro-Russia countries in Europe, certainly outside of Belarus. And although the protests that we're seeing in Belgrade aren't directly about Russia, they're about corruption, they are being portrayed by the Vucic government as being Western-backed, Western manipulated, which we know has exactly the sort of hallmarks of the sort of politics that we've seen play out in Ukraine, play out in Georgia, and Russia is very much keeping an eye on it and saying that they're concerned about it.
Yeah, there's no evidence that I have seen anywhere provided that corroborates the suggestion that this is all Western intelligence orchestrated. These are protests about corruption. These are protests about a state that have states that have grown remote, too powerful, too much corruption in them, and that something needs to be done. You go back to Belarus and the protests that were happening in Minsk that looked like they could topple the regime there. And suddenly Russia kind of lends reinforcements and help to suppress any protests. We're not at that stage yet, but you would almost say that Hungary, Serbia are in Moscow's sphere of influence. They will watch very warily anything that happens there. And what this kind of the state machinery in Serbia have tried to do, which was they tried to ban all, they stopped all public transport to try and stop people being able to go to the protests. Didn't work. Hundreds of thousands converged on Belgrade.
Amazing
to be
pictures
part.
over the weekend.
Yeah, exactly. And then there was the kind of rumours that there might be pro-government groups, brackets, biker gangs and football hooligans who might be converging to beat up the protesters as well. And you kind of see the potential there for the sort of unrest that destabilises countries that we've seen play out elsewhere.
Look, I think that you've got to see this as part of the wider picture, right? Which is that, yes, these protests in Serbia have been going on since November, actually prompted by the collapse of a concrete canopy at a newly renovated railway station. But as ever with these things, small things can light the touch paper with matters like this. And ever since, you've basically had protests driven by young people, students, though not exclusively them, bitterly complaining about their government, about how corrupt it is, about the future direction of travel. I mean, Serbia is an EU candidate country, but many in Serbia feel that it's been falling away from EU accession because of how close Vucic has been getting to Russia. And the last thing that the EU would want is another Viktor Orban type figure disrupting things from within. And we saw this weekend as well, similar protests in Hungary against the Orban government. Viktor Orban, obviously, nicknamed sort of Europe's dictator, certainly an authoritarian, it's fair to say, dominated Hungarian politics for the last 15 years, again, close to Putin. And, as we've reported on in this show, the ongoing protests which continue to grip Tbilisi and Georgia week after week after week for similar reasons. Again, so much of the politics of Eastern Europe right now continues to be about the fate and direction of travel of the post-Soviet successor states. In this case, of course, Serbia, Yugoslavia, rather than the Soviet Union, but still all the same. And about whose sphere of influence, if you want to use that phrase, which direction, let's put it that way, these countries go in, and the internal political divisions which drive those protests and those conflicts. That's not to say, again, these things are just about Russia, but certainly the spectre of Russia and Russia or Europe is certainly in the background to all of these things at the moment. And it is a very, very interesting development set of stories that are going on across Eastern Europe.
And obviously the big thing that we're all waiting for is the call between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, which is due to take place tomorrow. Lewis, I think you had someone on your show yesterday who had a certain viewpoint on all of this.
Yeah, I mean, it did. We were interviewed on the LBC show yesterday a guy called Sergei Markov, who used to be an advisor to Vladimir Putin. And again, if these
very even-handed,
yeah, very much so. I mean, very, it was a very generous conversation on both sides. I mean, if you want a sense of, again, and you're seeing this play out in Georgia and in Serbia and in Hungary as well. It's not just about contested politics, right? That's at stake right now, as in Ukraine. It's about contested realities. It's about different realities, different way of seeing the world entirely. And I think it's fair to say that played out between myself and Mr. Markov yesterday.
Russia has killed a lot of civilians, haven't they, Mr. Markov?
No.
What?
The point is that for Russians, Ukrainians, it's part of our people. The relation between
they're
Russia
separate. No, they're not. They're their own people. That's the problem with this war.
From our point of view, I'm talking about our point of view, not your point of view. From our point of view, the relation between Russians and Ukrainians, it's not like between British and French. It's between British and Scottish. It's British and English people. So it's part of the Ukraine, it's part of the big
in which case, why are you bombing your own people? In which case, why are you bombing your own people? If they're your own people, why would you bomb your own people and kill your own civilians and kidnap your own children?
It's exactly for the same reason why you bomb Nazi Germany, to liberate Germany from the neo-Nazi regime, from Adolf Hitler. And now
so Ukrainian kids had to die because Ukraine was in fact a Nazi regime. Do you realise how ridiculous that sounds?
Ukraine is neo-Nazi regime. You may know that main
Except it's had a democratic.
Nazi...
When was the last time Russia had a democratic election which is considered free and fair by international observers? Ukraine has had one more recently than yours.
Russia has main characteristic of democracy.
Right. What, like when opposition leaders get thrown out of windows?
Anyway, I'm going to be avoiding tall buildings for a little while.
Yeah, they'll be throwing rose petals down in the streets in Kyiv when the Russians
That's
arrive.
what Starmer's up against. That's because they believe it. I on some level, I think they actually believe it. And that is what, as much as anything. And Donald Trump apparently has some sympathy with some of this stuff. Crazy world.
We will be back tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.